In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a bike to run dual handlebars. The last couple days, I've been riding the hardtack in drop bar mode. We're about to ride some terrain that is a little bit rockier and sandier and more technical. In those situations, I prefer an alt bar. I couldn't bring two bikes on this trip, so I'm doing the next best thing, and that is one bike with two handlebars to, I think, pretty drastically alter the handling and the capability of the bike. The alt bars in questions are these guys. These are the Harvey Mushman bars by Crust Bikes. One thing you'll notice right away is I have everything pre-cabled with the housing, so all I really have to do is remove that cockpit and slip this one on. There are a couple things I did to make this a little bit easier to do, so let's get into it. The first thing I did, and probably the most controversial thing, was to run a C-tube shifter to actuate the front derailleur. This just makes it so there is one less cable I have to undo every time I swap the handlebars. A lot of you have asked why I just didn't do a down tube shifter. First off, there are no braze-ons here, and the second thing is that this is an oversized tube, so there were no aftermarket clamps that would put a down tube shifter pod here. So, reasons. A few more of the things I did to make this easier on myself is using cable cherries. Yes, they're not just for good looks, they make it really easy to remove cables from your bike without having to cut them and shorten them in the process. The third thing I did was to use these plastic cable clips and really limit the use of zip ties. There are two spots where I have to use two zip ties, but everything else are these reusable clips, and that makes it a lot quicker to swap the bars over. With all that said, let's start swapping the bars. First things first, I'm just going to undo the cable cherry really quickly. Try not to lose the grub screw in the sand here. Then I'm going to loosen the pinch bolt for the brake cable here. Then I'm going to pop off the reusable cable clip here. Just like that. Pull this through. Now we've got one brake free. Moving to the center of the bike, I'm just going to cut these two zip ties and replace them when I install the new bars. Those are the only two zip ties. Everything else are these replaceable cable clips. Second to last cable clip. We're over here. All right, so now we're to the rear brake, and same as the front brake, you just undo the cable cherry. Don't lose the grub screw, and then undo the pinch bolt. And at this point, that's it. The brake cable is completely free and ready to go. Okay, so just like the brakes, we have to undo these clips. Now the housing is essentially free. Oh, there's one more here. Shift the bike down to its smallest cog. We're gonna undo this last cable cherry. This is for the rear derailleur. And then undo the rear pinch bolt here. And basically, that's it. This final part is really straightforward. We're just going to undo the stem cap and remove the bars and the stem at the same time. You'll notice that with the drop bars, I'm running a much shorter stem. And with the alt bars, it's going to be a lot longer stem, but they're going to put my hands in the same relative position on the controls. Loosen these pinch bolts here. And there you go. Handlebars are officially swapped off. The housing and the inner cable are all intact and can be reinstalled later on when you want it. All right, so now basically we do the same process in reverse, putting the bars on and then working backwards to install all the cables. Attaching the stem and handlebar, like so. Okay, so I usually like to start with the front brake first, because that's fairly easy to do. All right, so the brake cable is threaded through the ferrule here. This goes through like so. Make sure it's well seated. It's feeling pretty good. Then lastly, install the cable cherry. So hopefully you guys can see why I love these things. They're actually really useful also, as well as adding some bling to your bike. Okay, brake is feeling good. And the last part is to just install the cable clip, which should just snap on, and bam. There you go. So that is one brake done. So for the rest of the bike, the way I usually like to tackle it is to attach the rear brake first, and then go backwards and use the clips where I have to, and then do the rear derailleur, clip it where I can, and then finally the zip ties. For this part, the cable routing is a little tight, so I like to install it without clipping it down first, just to make sure everything's going to fit well. This gives me a lot more flexibility to enter the rear caliper, as opposed to if everything's already tightened down. Tighten this part down. I'm going to put the other brake cable cherry back on. Now I like to work towards the cockpit and attach these clips. These last two have to be zip tied, and I'll zip tie the rear brake and the rear derailleur together. So for now, leaving this loose, but just being mindful of how it's going to go down the frame. We're going to do the rear derailleur like we did the rear brake. That is installing the cable first and then clipping back. And since this is a friction shifting bike, very little cable adjustment to do. So that is one thing I love about friction shifting. All right, got that tight. Now to work towards the front with these clips, and then we'll do the final zip tying. So now we're at the final part, and that is the zip tie part. Just gather the cables where you want them, put some zip ties. One really nice tool to have is a flush cutter. So this ensures that when you cut the zip tie, that there's no sharp pointy bits right there. So cuts it nice and flush, as the name suggests. So definitely carry one of these in your kit. As you can see, very minimal zip tie action, mostly clips, and that makes it fairly quick. All right, so just like that, we have set up our second handlebar on the same bike. I like to use this setup when things are going to get a little bit sketchier, it's going to be sandier and chonkier. These bars do give me a little bit more control, although they're not as comfortable as the drops on a longer ride. But I think the rides that we're going to be doing for the next week or so are going to be on the shorter side with more shenanigans, so this is a little bit more appropriate handlebar. I think this is a great way if you can only travel with one bike but want to have options. Hopefully this gives you guys some ideas. There is some fiddliness if you're doing a dual handlebar setup, but I'm hoping that this video gave you some inspiration, some ideas to kind of mitigate that. So using cable clips instead of relying just on zip ties, using things like the cable cherries so you can reuse the inner cable, and just having the handlebars connected to the stem ready to go. I think if I weren't filming, this whole process would probably take about 20 minutes. It's taken a lot longer because I'm filming, but don't be afraid to do things like this. If you guys dig this content, please consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon. And as always, keep the supple side down.